Welcome back to One Piece Explained, and welcome back to One Piece. After a 3-week break, we finally have Chapter 11-12, and there's a ton to talk about it between the powers of the Five Elders, the return of Stussy, and even a canonical inclusion from Film Red. So I want to get right into it, and if you end up enjoying this video or have enjoyed any of my other videos on the channel, be sure to like and subscribe and do the regular YouTube thing. It helps to support me and grow the channel. Alright, at the top of the chapter, we continue the Yamato cover story. In the last one, we had Yamato telling Momonosuke he wanted to travel across Wano just like Odin, and now we have Kinemon gifting them some money as a gift and requesting a favor. Not too much to go off of here. Kinemon could be asking for help with a lot of things, and considering that Yamato will be traveling across Wano, perhaps there's someone or someplace specific that Kinemon needs Yamato to visit. We'll just have to see. But now let's talk about Chapter 11-12, Hard Aspect. The name of this chapter is a reference to a concept in astrology where the particular angles formed by planets with respect to one another are known as aspects. Certain orientations of the planets are considered favorable, while others are deemed negative, and among these include the hard aspects, two of which are the square aspect and the opposition aspect. These occur when two planets are 90 degrees or 180 degrees apart respectively, meaning a great challenge is present. The square aspect in particular can create a strong tension where important decisions need to be made at a cost, which perfectly describes the situation that the Five Elders have found themselves in across these past few chapters. In order to stop Vegapunk's message, they've had to arrive at Egghead and split up to deal with all of these challenges before them. So with all of that said, let's get right into the chapter. We check back in on Nusjoro, who we last saw in 1110 as he was making his way across the perimeter of the island and mobilizing the Pacifista. We learned that he stopped all of the Mark III Pacifista by this point, which is pretty impressive considering that he arrived on the island with about 7 minutes left on the timer, and there's only 1 more minute to go at the end of this chapter. So to put that into perspective, he put down roughly 50 of these Pacifista in the span of about 6 minutes, while traversing the entire coast of Egghead. Pretty insane. Transitioning to the northeastern shore of Egghead, we check in on Oimo and Kashi as they retreat back to their ship. We had last seen them in 1107 charging across the island with the rest of their giant warrior pirates, and recall that in the last chapter, Vice Admirals Pomsky, Guillotine, and Red King were waiting in front of the giant warrior pirates ship in order to intercept Bonney. And here, we get this really cool clash between two cyborgs, as Vice Admiral Red King readies what I can only assume is the steam knuckle technique that we saw him use earlier in this arc against one of those mecha sea beasts. But before it can connect, Franky gets through with his classic strong right to Red King's face, destroying his mechanical arm in the process. Now, some of you may be wondering how Franky was able to overcome the haki of a Vice Admiral like this. Now, Red King did use armament hardening on his fist, just as he did with the technique when it first debuted, as you can see that his hand is not coated when he's winding up. However, the coating is not extended to the entire arm. Red King likely expected to trade blows with Franky or have their fists clash, and was not expecting Franky's fist to extend out like that. As we know, Franky's strong right is as strong as a rocket, and as such, it was enough to break through the Vice Admiral's mechanical arm. Even though Franky has not been shown to have haki, it's really cool to see him able to deal with a Vice Admiral like this with some clever moves. And as a sidebar, I don't think I've mentioned this in the breakdowns yet, but I'm wondering if Red King is actually part of the Snake Neck tribe, given his particularly long neck. We first learned of this race all the way back during the Sabati Archipelago arc, but only really saw them explicitly in the Whole Cake Island arc with Big Mom's children such as Amand, Mascarpone, and Jascarpone. And if he is a Snake Neck, then he would be the first one we've seen in the series that isn't part of Big Mom's family, unless of course we find out that Gecko Moria was also part of this race. The blow Red King receives here reminds me a bit of Bonney's attack on Alpha, given their reactions, though the giant fist leading up to the face is replaced with his humongous neck. Speaking of Bonney, she ends up dealing with Pomsky by hilariously turning him into a child and kicking him in the face, much to Guillotine's dismay, who can't bear the sight of it. This kind of thing was exactly what made the Bonney pirates so notorious, as they were thought to have just been beating up children and elderly folk the whole time. If we're to believe this means Pomsky and Red King are out of the picture for now, then including Tosa, who was flattened by Dory and Brogy earlier, that makes 3 Vice Admirals who are out of the picture. If Guillotine's defeat was off-screened, given how we see Franky, Bonney, and Atlas deal with a greater threat at the end of the chapter, then that's 4 out of the 9 Vice Admirals that have been defeated. Dahl and Bluegrass were headed for the northeastern shore as well, while Hound, Doberman, and Urban were last seen on their ships, so we'll have to see what becomes of them. Over on the Labophase, we check back in on the true comedy that is Vegapunk's message. After having invented instant coffee because brewing regular coffee would take longer than 10 minutes, he is now unable to drink it because he has to wait for it to cool down. So then he starts thinking about inventing something to speed that process up. And we can see that the monitor we're seeing the message here is the same one that we saw where the broadcast first started. You can tell given the flatline heartbeat monitor here. It seems Mars and York have located the room where the message was recorded, and so he immediately blasts a hole through it. Now in the previous chapter breakdown, I mentioned how Mars seemingly had some sort of electricity or lightning based abilities given all the crackling around him, and it would seem that this is part of that power set. It's depicted somewhat similarly to Kaido's blast breath, but it has electricity spiraling around it. He plans on destroying the entire lab in order to stop the broadcast, but York protests and explains that that level of damage will end up destroying Punk Records itself, as well as the power plant, two things that the Elders wanted to secure. We get a quick reminder of the layout of the lab with some new information for some of the floors, so for good measure, let's review the whole lab. We learn that the first floor of the building B is the power plant that produces the Mother Flame. Above that is the weapons development floor that we saw earlier in this arc with Sanji, Jinbei, and Stussy. The second floor of Building A is where the organoids research was taking place, first shown with Atlas, Robin, and Chopper, and it's also the place where we saw Jinbei and Sanji help gather some things for Vegapunk when they were preparing to leave. On the third floor of Building A is where synthetic materials are created, such as the synthetic diamond we saw with Nami, Brook, and Edison. And on the fourth floor is the command room where Stussy and Kaku were left. Now over in Building C, we only really know of the place that Usopp, Franky, Lilith, and York were sent to looking for Pythagoras after he was attacked. And in this chapter, we learn that this is where some high-pressure gas cylinders are stored. There's also, of course, the basement where the Cypher Pole agents were being held prisoner, which was the old Devil Fruit Research Lab. That leaves about 4 floors across 3 buildings unaccounted for. One of these may be where the power room is located, perhaps somewhere in Building C, given that there was a staircase going up a floor shown from outside the room. The first floor of Building A is where I imagine we first saw the crew enter the lab, and perhaps where the Seraphim were being kept. The third floor of Building B looks to have been destroyed after the attack by the Seraphim, but we'll just have to see. Also, it's interesting that so much of the lab is set up in such a way that any significant damage to it would be enough to blow up Punk Records itself. We know Vegapunk's previous labs on Baltimore and Punk Hazard both had self-destruct buttons, so I wonder if there is an explicit one somewhere on this lab. York tells Mars that she knows how to put an end to this as she picks up what looks to be a bazooka or RPG of some sorts. It doesn't quite resemble the bubblegum that we saw Lilith use earlier in the arc, but she reassures Mars of her loyalty, mentioning how the Vegapunks are already on the bad side of the Elders and how she doesn't want to make things worse when Mars suddenly senses something small up inside Punk Records. York seems to have realized that the only way for Vegapunk to broadcast something like this would be through the use of the new transponder snails they had recently made, and if there's something up there, then Vegapunk probably stored that snail inside Punk Records. But there's something a bit strange here. For context, York did not know Vegapunk left a message that would activate upon his death, most likely because she had not been syncing with the rest of the Vegapunks for what looks to have been about 3 months since she first started reporting Vegapunk's research of the Void Century. However, she did realize the message was being sent out via a specific transponder snail that they had finished up recently, and I'll talk more about that a bit later in the video. But for what reason would she need this type of heavy-duty weaponry to deal with that snail? I don't think she'd be plotting anything more at this point, but I do wonder what this weapon is going to be for. Though, now that York is free and has the power of the Elders on her side, she may be getting ready to grab the Seraphim from the basement. Now Mars goes off to handle it as we get the return of Stussy, who we haven't seen in about 20 chapters, as she was last shown taking a finger pistol for Vegapunk. That was also when we last saw Kaku in real time, before seeing Lucci's mental image of him in the last chapter, and unlike that image, Kaku is still trapped in a bubble here. That discussion between York and Mars about their relationship seems to have tipped Stussy off that the monstrous bird was one of the 5 Elders, and we learn that Stussy has stayed up behind to allow the rest of the crew to escape by letting the Frontier Dome down. Very reminiscent of how Bon Clay stayed behind to allow the others escape in Alabasta and Impel Down. Meanwhile, Edison flies off into the Frontier Dome to ensure the Straw Hats are able to make their way to the ocean, somehow. I don't think he'll die just yet, but he does have some death flags rising up with this one. Now we check back in with Luffy, Dory, and Brogy, who we last saw running away from Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter, who is now creating a gigantic island-wide vortex with his mouth, sucking in debris and people alike, with enough strength to even prevent the giants from getting too far away. Luffy manages to stop this by clogging his mouth with part of a building, but unfortunately he looks to run out of steam and phase out of gear 5th. Thankfully, the Giants provide him with some of their emergency food supply that they keep on them, and this is a bit funny considering that Sanji and Luffy have referred to Chopper as an emergency food supply in the past, the most recent instance being when Luffy and Chopper were fishing on the way to Whole Cake Island. Here, Brogy provides Luffy with some hakal, which is a fermented shark, typically the Greenland shark, which similarly to giants can live much longer than normal humans, almost up to 500 years. This reinvigorates Luffy to be able to take action against Mercury, who is now rampaging towards them. Luffy brings back his Gum Gum Red Rock, which we first saw used against Kaido, but for some reason, the attack doesn't do much to Mercury and instead hurts Luffy's hand and seemingly lights it aflame. This is pretty impressive considering that despite how tough Kaido was, Luffy was still able to make contact with him without taking damage back. Meanwhile, merely touching Mercury is difficult for him. It's not completely clear if the flames are the result of Luffy's Red Rock or if his hand was impacted by the flames on Mercury's back, back, something that he also shares with Saturn, who, speaking of, seems to have made his way over to the back of the Labophase where the rest of the Straw Hats were preparing for their departure. I'm assuming he's here because of the information that Lucci shared with Mars in the last chapter about everyone's status, and recall that the Elders have some sort of telepathy, which may have prompted Saturn to handle this half of the crew. Usopp readies himself for some combat as the others are taken aback, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, considering that among the group is the quote-unquote weakling trio or the cowardly trio, though we do know Usopp quite likes spiders, so perhaps that'll help out. I am a bit concerned about Robin though, since she's still injured and the world government would actively want to capture her. Back down on the northeastern coast of the island, the giants that were with Franky's group get cut down by Nusjuro, who towers over Franky, Bonney, and even Atlas. While it would be very nice to see more of the Straw Hats get some action and screen time against the five elders, I should note that Sanji, Zoro, and Jinbei are all headed for these two locations, with Sanji and Vegapunk's body rushing towards Franky's group, and Jinbei and Zoro toward Usopp's group. It looks like we won't get the Zoro and Nusjuro matchup that people have been longing for, but it would be very interesting to see how Nusjuro's speed matches up with Sanji's stealth black. Not only that, but Luffy and the rest of the giants are also heading for this location, so backup should be on the way. Now the final elder who is taking position here is Mars, who has seemingly made his way into Punk Records through a little hatch or door up above, which I suppose is why Mars had to refer to his human form. Quick sidebar here. He's shown with his overcoat even though he didn't have it on when we last saw him before he was summoned, so I kinda like the idea that Mars was like, wait, before we go, let me grab my coat. Egghead's a winter island, it's gonna be cold. Anyways, with only 1 minute left on the countdown, he approaches the transponder snail that York described earlier. Now, if you've seen Film Red, this should be very familiar to you, as this is the same model of transponder snail that Uta had used for her live streams across the world. Uta found these snails when they were mysteriously washing up on the shore of Elysia. While the events of Film Red are not canon, there are bits of lore and world building that are, just like we've seen across the more recent One Piece films. In the supplementary volume 4 Billion, which contains canonical details about various aspects of characters in the film, we learned that this livestream transponder snail was developed by Vegapunk and the SSG, or the Special Science Group, which are basically him and his satellites. In the volume, we learned that all the prototypes were lost and had somehow made their way to Uta, and in this chapter, we learned that the Vegapunks completed work on it relatively recently. So in Film Red, Uta got her hands on the snails 2 years ago, so if that part is true, then these have been in the works for about over 2 years. The inclusion of the snail is pretty cool, considering that we do know Uta exists in the canon, much like how Shiki exists, but the events of Strong World are not canon, and in hindsight, the arrival of the ancient demon taught Musica bears some striking similarities to the arrival of the Five Elders, with all of this black smoke and lightning, so perhaps there's something going on here. Either way, this may have some very interesting implications. Currently, Vegapunk's broadcast is a pre-recorded message, but this snail is able to be used for live streams, which means in theory, it could be used to showcase the events of Egghead should it need to. Now, I've seen some speculation that this is all some elaborate plan by Vegapunk to expose the Five Elders' forms to the world, and while I think that's somewhat possible, I don't think it's really likely. Given everything we've seen from Vegapunk, he didn't know about the Five Elders' powers, nor did he know that they would even be here on Egghead. In the broadcast itself, he mentions how he doesn't expect anyone to be able to stop the message within 10 minutes anyways, so I think it's possible he had some plan to showcase the destruction of Egghead, but I doubt he had any idea the Five Elders would be involved on the island itself. Now the chapter ends off on Mars noticing a strange sound coming from above. It's difficult to determine exactly what this is. It's a sort of bubbling sound, and it could be Vegapunk's brain. After all, it's supposed to be stored here in Punk Records, and we've long speculated if Punk Records itself could be sentient at some point down the line. There's also some chance that this is a trap of some sorts for anyone that comes near the snail. Perhaps it shoots out a bubble to ensnare the enemy. I'm not really sure, but I'm excited to see what becomes of this, and I'm curious to hear what you all think is going to happen next. And that's about it for all I wanted to talk about in this breakdown. If there's anything you thought was interesting or want to bring up, let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for all the support you guys have been showing recently. I really appreciate it, and if you enjoyed this video or any of my other videos, be sure to like and subscribe. As always, thank you so much for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.